Bahat. I run Bloomberg Beta, which is Bloomberg's venture capital fund. We invest exclusively in the future of work, and I'm arguably the least substantively expert person who's going to talk today because I'm more of a listener and learner on this subject. I'm not an economist. I'm not a technologist, even though in a sense I make my living by giving a basic income to technologists so they can work on their ideas. And I'm going to do something that's a little bit unusual for a guy who makes his trade, and then why don't we just open this up, who makes his trade investing in the future, which is I'm going to tell you that I actually think, can you just get me to the beginning here, that our predictions about the future might not matter. The entire debate we've all been having about, what will the effect of automation be on jobs, and will it be X percent or Y percent of the jobs that are taken? It might be a not so useful way to look at things. And together with New America, Bloomberg did a year-long study to try to think about, well, could we act despite not having accurate predictions about the future? And the good news is there are tools for how to do this. And so I'm going to talk about how we did that a bit. So first, just our fund. I'll say, in addition to us investing in the future of work, our journey on this started because we were one of the first venture capital funds to put our hand up and say, hey, this artificial intelligence thing, it might be real. So this was late 2014, and I've found only one blog post from a single other venture capitalist saying that artificial intelligence was mature. And one of my partners came to me and she said, we should do this. And I said, you've been reading too much science fiction. It's way too early. And then she said, okay, but I'm going to work on it. And I said, your time is your own. Be my guest. And she studied more than 2,000 startups doing something in machine intelligence. And this was the landscape that she produced about all of the different domains in which they were operating. And so immediately, like a school of fish, we swam in that direction. My favorite meal to eat is my own words. And we decided to focus on this. And in the first year, it was mostly the nerds who were paying attention. It was academics who were working on this and saying, yes, you finally heard us. This might happen. And that was great. And then the second year we looked again, and you can see there are even more companies. And this is when the investors show up at the party, because we're usually there once things are mature, not at the beginning, and begin actively investing in this area, and the hype cycle kind of begins. And then this is last year's study, even more mature, as you can see. And this is when the big corporates start to pay attention, and we start to get calls from boardrooms and C-suites saying, what do we do about this? And of course, the hysteria arrives. Newspaper headlines, the chart on the side there, it is not the rising price of Bitcoin. This is public companies using the phrase artificial intelligence in a quarterly earnings call. So you can see this is kind of becoming central to the conversation. And that's when I started to think, wait a minute, if we're the ones investing in this, maybe we ought to have a view on how the whole society and economy will fit together once we start rapidly automating all of this work. It felt incumbent on us to understand that. And so that's when I began what I call my year of going to Future of Work conferences. Fortunately, there was no shortage of them. Many of you have been to many of them. And I developed this shorthand for the kabuki theater of all Future of Work conferences, which is first a tech person says, watch out. Artificial intelligence is accelerating, and either it's going to be a utopia or a dystopia, but either way, duck. And what's notable to me about artificial intelligence is it is very rare within the technology industry to have a technology that's being developed at a pace that continuously surprises the very people who are working on it. If you think about the arrival of something like the mobile internet, there was a decade when every year they said, in 2 more years, we're going to have a phone with a web browser. And then the next year it was in 2 more years. And in this case, you have people saying, we'll be able to do that in 2017. And then a year later, let's say it's in 2014, they'll say, oh, no, actually it looks like 2016 now. And the dates keep getting pulled inward, and that's really rare. So the techie says, watch out. The economist then says, calm down, everybody. Total employment always turns out to be fine. Ironically, you techies, you're Luddites. What I always say is total employment turns out to be fine if you're an economist. And then everybody resolves this by saying, well, it's not just about work, it's about meaning. And of course, the discussion that we just had was a very valuable indicator of why that is true. And we'll talk about that. And they'll say we need a new social contract, which is true. And then the gig economy comes up, lifelong learning, and we don't get anywhere. And what has happened to us is, as a chattering class, the complexity of this issue has just reduced us to kind of blathering at one another. And we wondered, is there some way to get past this? And we have to start with a guess as to why we're doing this. Well, one possible reason is that there are some good ideas, but nobody is listening, or they don't understand one another, which, believe me, I live in the foreign country of Silicon Valley, and it is frequent that it is difficult to understand one another. The second possibility is that there actually are no good ideas. And to try to explore this is actually a lot more challenging than you may think, because it does bring us back to this question of what will happen. So, like I said, I don't believe this question matters, and I'll explain why. But I also know the answer to this question. So, I've seen all the studies you've seen. 40% of the jobs will be taken away. 90% of the jobs will be taken away. Somebody asked me, how many jobs will the robots take? My conclusive and definitive answer is 100%. There's no question that this is true. In fact, the reason it's true is because it's already been true. If you think about the work that we do today compared to an imaginary person hundreds of years ago looking at us, they'll say all the jobs are gone. And so really the question that we're actually talking about is the one that we sidestep. The question we're actually talking about is, when will this happen? How will it unfold? What will the path look like? And this is a bedevilingly difficult question. I'll give you one example. 10 years ago, Business Week, this is in the ugly design era of Business Week before, I'll add, Bloomberg owned it, they did an issue on the future of work, 2007. This issue, by the way, is a fascinating relic. Facebook, it's coming to the over 35-year-olds. How to build a brand, using Donald Trump as an example. Does anybody have a guess on what the #1 profession is that this issue expected would decline in the United States? Education, software engineer. The guess was software engineer because of offshoring. The fear was offshoring. And of course, didn't account for the fact that there would be massive demand for more computing work that needed to be done. And so, knowing that we couldn't do an accurate point prediction, together with New America, we decided to use a method that can address some of this, which is the method of scenario planning, of imagining different possibilities in some sort of dramatically oversimplified way for the purpose of contrasting them and figuring out, can we take action even if we don't know precisely what will happen? Added benefit, the only way to do this is to bring together the very communities that were struggling to talk to one another. And one of the reasons, Moshe, while I'm so grateful for a room like this one, is that we still do not have enough opportunities to really converse with one another. And so we called this shift the Commission on Workers and Technology. Kristen Sharp, who led the commission, is going to be here, and my co-chair, Anne-Marie Slaughter, is speaking later tonight. Kristen's here in the room right now. How do we go about this? We said we would imagine scenarios, so not try to predict what will happen. We wanted to take a very specific view on when we would think about, which was far enough away that a lot of things could change, but close enough in that we were not talking about, evaporating into the machine. That's 20 years. And we wanted to involve all of the different disciplines that we could think of and have as diverse a group as possible on every possible dimension. And that meant, yes, the usual characters, economists, technologists, venture capitalists, but also video game developers, arts nonprofit leaders, science fiction writers, etc. And we held 5 meetings across the United States with 100 leaders. Unlike a usual commission, Anne-Marie calls this an uncommission, in the sense that in a usual commission, you sit in a room with the same people, talk to each other, and then group dynamics take hold. In this case, we actually ran the same session 5 times. And it was illuminating, because we discovered that the most useful things to think about were some of the things that did not change. This is a picture from our Detroit session. Just getting people to understand what's already happening, the aging of the workforce. The fact that, surprise, surprise to Silicon Valley, our economy's dynamism is actually slowing, not accelerating. Increasing inequality between not just people, but also places and firms, and the shift in our economy from income coming from more sources than just work to an increasing degree. And to help us empathize with the communities that we were trying to understand, because of course it's a valid criticism that they were not generally in this room, we drew random personas from the census and assigned them to individuals. And so the 38-year-old median age hit more than a single person. By the way, the whole idea of average Joe is absurd because we know there are more women than men. So it's actually average Jennifer. It's not average Jane, by the way, because if you look 38 years ago at popular names in the US, Jennifer was #1 that year. Jane is number 326. And we did some quantitative research, which I'll share in a second, but to give us a fabric for our imagination, and we don't pretend that this study is conclusive. It is, by definition, an imaginative exercise. We talked to some of the people who'd be affected. So we talked to individuals who, in addition to working, were caring for an elderly family member. And we talked to truck drivers about the self-driving truck, which to my surprise, I just figured somebody else had already done that. We just read what they did. We couldn't find anybody who had. And so let me just share with you briefly what the truck drivers said. And by the way, we asked them when would the self-driving truck happen. Pretty uniform consensus that it would be 40 years, which a lot of people in this room probably laugh at, but they might be right. We really don't know. It depends on what some state legislature does. So we then showed them the video of the then Otto, now Uber, making an autonomous truck beer delivery. And this is the truck driver's surprising reaction. It's a little less than a minute long.
There you go.
Oh, I hope the audio is playing. Can we get the, and I'm happy to come back to it if we, what's that? I don't know why, it doesn't need to come up on the screen, it's audio. We just need to hear it. It just needs to be loud enough for people to hear it.
Oh, look at it. He can just take a break.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so here, they're listening. This is the tail end of the video.
Truck is driving itself?
Truck's driving
Oh, look
itself.
at it. He can just take a break.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And
They
so
love
that's
it.
autopilot for the truck. You think about it as a plane, though. Like when
Yeah,
you
planes have autopilots,
You would somebody,
yeah.
they do autopilot. so.
Yes.
They don't have traffic though.
What if it was like you and that's your partner? Like
Yeah,
you,
exactly. That's what I'm thinking.
you run your 11 hours and then put it on that and drive another
They
11. You
want
can
the
go to
self-driving
California
truck
and
with
back
them
like
in the
no
cab.
Why they
You'd
want
be making bank. That'd be cool. If I could do that all day, like, all right, here. And I'll just get out and deliver. It would be sweet.
They wouldn't pay them.
Oh, they've been having this whole conversation about how amazing it would be to have a self-driving truck with them. And sorry, let me just close this. To have a self-driving truck with them. And then only after considering it at length and talking about how it helped them get around driving restrictions. By the way, I learned truck drivers love technology. Technology helps them schedule their shifts. This is not a group sitting there thinking, quaking in their boots. And I don't know, maybe that's the right attitude, maybe it's not. But at the very least, it helps us think that Homo economicus is not the right way to think about expectations about the future. And I think those expectations are critical to the answer. So we went and examined potential scenarios. And the way scenario planning works, you reduce the complexity to a few key variables that you change. So we picked 2 out of 16, and we had a group of the good and the great. You maybe saw in one of those pictures, but Peter Norvig literally wrote the textbook. A number of really magnificent human beings helped us decide. Issue 1 was, would work continue to be primarily in the form of full-time jobs, or would it fractionalize? Pick your word, tasks, gigs, whatever. Issue number 2, would automation mean there was more work available in total, or the same amount, or less work available in total? And what we came up with, surprise by surprise, is this 2x2 of different scenarios, and I'll just quickly talk about them. So if you have less work and it's fractionalized, we named them all after games to help us imagine them. And by the way, we have copies of our report here, which you can grab, which have a little narrative of a day in the life in each of them. But we called that rock, paper, scissors, because you're kind of just endlessly going with all these little tasks. It sort of never stops. And it's a competitive game. If there's more work available, we called that jump rope, because it's creative, there's infinite forms, it's not finite. And if there's if there's less work, but it's mostly jobs, well, that is potentially a brutally competitive world. Could be good, depending on how the society responds. That's the king of the castle scenario. And in honor of the AI progress that technologists have made, if there's more work and it's mostly jobs, we call that the go economy, something deep and sustained, extended. Now, you're probably looking at this and thinking, oh, that one over there is the utopia scenario or the dystopia scenario. And I promise you in our sessions, and this was surprising to me, every single one of these had somebody intelligently saying, oh, that's the utopia, or that's the dystopia. Every single one of these had somebody saying, that's the extrapolation of the status quo. Oh, no, that's the extrapolation of the status quo. And what I took from that is maybe the exact path of what happens matters a lot less than how we respond to it. And maybe what we should think about are the similarities between these scenarios and not their differences. And so what are the similarities? One is the intense focus on stability for the worker. I mean, that uncertainty question came up. We asked people, what do you value about work in our quantitative research? And they do value meaning if they make $150,000 a year or more. For everybody else, and for the median American, the number one thing that people value over earning more money, doing something I enjoy, all these other things, earning as stable and secure an income as possible. This is about safety. Second, the role of older Americans, which Silicon Valley so often overlooks, is much more important to understand than the role of young Americans to me, and we need to shift that conversation. Third, we raised this briefly, the role of unpaid work. And then, we were trying to figure out what occupations might there be, and the only consistent idea that came up was some form of personal economic control. And I don't mean entrepreneurship in the sense of start a tech company, despite the fact that obviously when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so of course I'd want more people to be entrepreneurs. I just mean people controlling their own economic destiny, the only job from which you can't be fired, working for yourself. And so what I took from that is actually the issue is not, per se, automation and what will happen. It's today, in the present, our expectations and fears about automation, and then the transition. The speed, the unpredictability. We can talk about the self-driving truck, but I'm equally focused on the self-auditing accountant and the self-lending mortgage officer and the self-researching journalist. The self-investing venture capitalist would be a saving grace for me. And let me just share some of our quantitative research. We just tried to figure out how stable are Americans' incomes. And there is some panel data on this. We did a simple survey. It turns out the thing that all of us think of as regular work, making a salary, only applies to 46% of working people. This isn't everybody, this is working people. So the thing that many of us think of as the default is actually the minority of Americans who experience that. I've been calling this the potential for the great American disappointment in expectations, which is that we ask people, do you expect your kids to make more money than you do? 73% do. The last year in which people were born where 73% of them would make more than their parents, 1955. And I just think that from this, net job creation in the future looks pretty irrelevant. Only 12% of people today fear losing their jobs. Think of those truck drivers. But the expectations in the present might be the thing that changes. And so then what do you do about this? And we were explicitly focused on finding questions, not answers. This was not an attempt to find the policy solutions that we did. Sort of that Einstein quote about, if you want to solve something, spend 95% of your time thinking about the problem and 5% on the solution, something like that. And my view is, where we're constrained is not so much advocacy, but hypotheses. We have too few good hypotheses about what to do. And everybody is paralyzed, and I'll finish in a second. But I'll just say, the corporate CEOs who say, what do I do about this? Too few good answers. Government, federal, state, nobody knows what an automation policy looks like. Workers are paralyzed. I mean, one of the reasons why I have spent so much time studying basic income is because it seems like one of the clear hypotheses that actually applies. As a friend of mine said, he called it option Z. The only issue is nobody can think of options A through Y. And I think there is some real truth to that. And so where might we forage? Well, the first thing is we still have so little data here. I mean, it's unbelievable. One of the reasons we have so little data on unpaid work is because decades ago, some people got in a room, and they were propertied white men, and they said, let's figure out what kind of work we can measure. Oh, domestic work? That's going to be way too hard to measure. So they don't include it in GDP. Meanwhile, they create an edifice of hundreds, if not thousands of people who make a living trying to calculate the finer points of GDP. And this thing we especially don't have data on is volatility of income. We think about things like annual household income as a lump sum. One of the reasons I do believe that means testing is complicated is because you have plenty of people in a family where the family has plenty of money, but an individual in that family is suffering, an abused spouse, for example. And we don't understand these effects because of where we've chosen to look in the data. Unemployment, seems to me mostly a survey on the psychology of seeking work as opposed to an economic number. Number two, thinking about how to justify greater government investment in technology. I mean, at the tail end of the Obama administration, there was that pair of reports about AI. The stunning number for me was only $1 billion invested in AI research. It seems pretty clear to me that there is more than one regional government in China investing at least that amount. And the third, which may be what ties into a basic income again, is around what will people do? And there's some promising research from international trade around occupational clustering, an economist at Brookings. And I think about entrepreneurship and local entrepreneurship as one of the answers. But again, these are foraging grounds for hypotheses. My plea to you is that all of you think about it and please tell me the answer. And so I'll just end. We surveyed our commission members by asking them, is this time different? And we did come up with a conclusive answer. And so my kind of observation about spending a lot of time betting on the future and imagining it is when you look at the future, you begin to realize we need to study the present and the past, and all the data, all the information we need to know what to do is sitting right here in front of us. And so I hope you'll come up with some hypotheses. Thank you.
Tony, hey, yes, I'm curious about your focus on age, because it seems to me the focus on youth employment is actually one of the most urgent things. 19 to 24-year-olds in Spain, the unemployment among youth is now around 40%. It was higher, and it's 20% in Italy, and these are not primitive countries. So, and then you're going to have waves of migrants, economic, political wars, and now climate change migrants, and there are lots of young people, and unless they have a stake in society, it's going to be extremely unstable, and that wasn't in your scenario anyway. Or was it?
So a caveat, which is our work was focused on the United States, and so the different role of youth in different places completely excluded from our work. And I think if you look, yes, of course we talked about the effect of youth and on education for younger people. We didn't specifically talk about climate because we had to draw the lines of scope somewhere. The argument about older people is that almost all of the attention has been on younger people. Almost all the attention in the public discussion. It's very difficult to find a future of work piece that does not use the word millennials, and so we felt like it was important to shift the attention given that, so we put our fingers on the scales a little bit. But it's obviously a limited analysis. Thank you.
Sheldon Jacobson, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you very much. Great comments. One thing I always think about is the Seinfeld television program, where they would have a final place they would get to, and then they would write the script backwards, but play it forward. Mm-hmm. And in academia, when we do research, we often know where we're trying to get to, and then we have to write the paper and do the research forward to get there. In some sense, can we apply that principle here, that where do we want to be, and then see how we can get there, as opposed to looking at what we have and moving forward? I kind of throw that out to you, but anybody to think about. Is that a better approach?
Yeah, I think that it's certainly a useful and complementary approach. And I've been thinking about where we get those visions of the future from. And a surprising place I've decided to look is in speculative fiction, in science fiction especially. The Economic Security Project, which is a group I'm involved with that studies basic income, has sponsored what is the largest open submission short story contest ever for a short story including a basic income. And the reason I think fiction is so powerful is because fiction has very tight rules. You know, when we say things that happen in the real world and we say, oh, that's stranger than fiction, what we really mean is that actually fiction is more constrained than reality in some ways, and therefore a very useful tool for imagining a consistent system for the future. And so that's one place that I'm personally am looking, although, and also the observation I have just in my narrow corner of the tech world is that many, many, many inventors, technologists, builders were inspired by fiction that they read. And that's, you know, seeped into their brain. And so I think that's a good lever for changing things, but I think that approach is completely complementary to this and valuable. Thank you.
Rick Arthur from General Electric. As an engineer, sometimes when we don't have an answer, we
Speak closer to the mic.
Sometimes if you don't have an answer, one of the things you can answer with is a model. And in understanding the sensitivities and cascading effects of some of the things that are being faced by Congress, tax policy, healthcare, et cetera, as we get to precarious jobs and employer-based dependency for some of this, would be to be able to see with whatever assumptions the given viewer would like to plug into the model and how that might play out. I work with people in the DOE labs that run big supercomputers and very sophisticated systems, and yet the underlying data, to your point, is difficult. So one of the things, I guess, as policymakers are making these grand decisions and as investors are trying to decide what this future outlook looks like, to play forward on the assumptions and see how do we, I guess, pull together the right data and factors and models so that we can, as a group, actually see this.
Yeah, I mean, I just say the data are at least 2 orders of magnitude. It seems to me less voluminous than data about, for example, climate change, where models have been very useful and exceptionally useful. And I think everybody in this room should probably be terrified about the 2020 census, because that is in many ways the anchor for the data that we have. And not only are we not getting more data, we're actually in danger of slipping backwards. So sure, would love a model. I think there was a question up here.
Last question here.
Oh, no, hold on. Let's not have all guys ask questions. Did you have a question up here?
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, but that's okay.
So I've read the report before, and in fact I was on a panel with Kristen earlier this year. So what if amongst our 4 scenarios, so there's no average Joe or Jane or Sophia or Hakeem or any of them, what if we see mixed scenarios? So I could very plausibly, as I probably will, see a king of the hill for one segment of society and a jump rope for everyone else.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, these are, sorry, did you?
No, please, run with that.
No, these are oversimplified abstractions to help us think. And of course, the incidence of these changes on different groups is the whole ballgame. You know, one of the limited ways that we tried to model was just by saying, what are the variables we can watch in the next few years to see how things unfold and try to predict at least what path it looks like we're on. But I think that these are ways to have a conversation as opposed to mutually exclusive truths, because the future will include all of them to some degree. And then the other thing I'd say is, I think we've been erring too far in general, maybe this is just following on your point or building on it, on the side of overall societal views. There's a reason why this is called the Schiff Commission on Workers, and Technology, is that taking the view of individuals or communities of individuals seems like it might be even more valuable. You know, the balloon isn't going to pop by being squeezed overall, it's going to get a pinprick. And so that's, I think, a very valuable way to look at it.
Yeah, well, and in extending that slightly, I feel like there's another tendency to look at the world in a very static way. It is this way. They responded to the survey in this particular fashion. How do we address those issues rather than what is the dynamic? Could we play a role in actually changing their responses? Yeah, I think those are exactly the right questions. I mean, the humility before the unknown and the fact that we face a very complex, many variable, many groups of society probability distribution of outcomes is really the point, and that's why simplistic utopian and dystopian prognostication seems to me mostly like a waste of time.
Yeah, so I was struck by the emphasis in this presentation and the previous presentation on stability, right, and income stability. So economists have had this notion of wage insurance for 30 years, and some of the most clearly articulated proposals have actually come from the most market-oriented schools of economic thought, like Robert Lalonde at the University of Chicago. I mean, was this an idea that you
So again, we barely focused on discussing solutions. So I'm looking for complete hypotheses. The only thing I'd say about insuring wages is that if the issue is that your contribution to society isn't measured in wages, then it seems like you have a problem at the starting point. But for sure, all kinds of income smoothing schemes, pay-in schemes, I mean, there's all kinds of ways of thinking about it, and I think there's a rich domain there for discussion.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Moshe.